is Eileen Burke, and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. The videotaping today is sponsored by the Historic Preservation Fund of the U.S. Department of the Interior through the Nebraska State Historical Society and the City of Lincoln as certified local government. Our speaker today is Stephanie Rouse. Stephanie is a planner. She's a planner with the Lincoln-Lancaster County Planning Department in Lincoln, and she focuses on sustainable activities including historic preservation, active transportation, and advancing Lincoln's climate action plan goals. She received her Bachelor's of Science in Architecture and a Master's of Community and Regional Planning, both at the University of Nebraska here in Lincoln. She has worked extensively on local and national register designations, historic reconnaissance surveys, and historic design guidelines. In her current role, she staffs the Historic Preservation Commission, working with applicants on certificates and nominations, preparing staff reports, and making recommendations on monthly meetings. Stephanie's talk today is on Lincoln's Historic Preservation Program. Please join me in welcoming Stephanie.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming down to be here today for this brown bag lecture on Lincoln's Historic Preservation Program. My experience with the preservation program actually began about 12 years ago as Ed's intern. I was doing a lot of research and worked on my first National Register nomination, which was the Rose Kirkwood brothel, and always said that I wanted to come back and take over Ed's position, and eventually I managed to do that. So, what is preservation? So preservation, while a lot of the program is about preserving buildings, it does expand onto landscapes and open spaces as well. It's really preserving the stories and provides a connection with the past, and it tells, what we decide to preserve or fight to preserve really tells what is important and our collective values as a community. It also is an economic development tool. I think everyone can look at the historic Haymarket and see what a success that historic district has been over the years for supporting local retail and restaurants. And it's also sustainable. Carl Elefant has been coined with the term saying that the greenest building is the one that's already standing. So maintaining and preserving historic buildings is keeping a lot of the negative impacts of demolition and new construction from our communities. So starting with preservation, kind of the code or the more formal preservation history in our nation, it goes back further than 1926 with different groups and individuals fighting to save individual buildings across the nation. But in 1926 was this famous land use case called Euclid. As a planning student, we learned about this one because it set up the concept of zoning, where you can say where different types of uses and separating industrial from residential, and zoning is the basis for a lot of historic preservation programs and the City of Lincoln's historic preservation program. The first historic preservation ordinance was passed in 1931 by Charleston, and in 1935 the Historic Sites Act was established the National Historic Landmark Program, of which Lincoln has two. So the state capitol, it was listed as a National Historic Landmark in 1970 based on the design of the building by Bertram Goodhue. And then the William Jennings Bryan House, which was built in 1902, 1903, and was really significant for the U.S. Congressman and three-time presidential candidate. In the 1930s, there was a lot of federal programs that were devoted to history, arts, what's called the Historic American Building Survey, where you documented historic structures really intensively, doing architectural drawings, photographing histories, and then a series of American guide series, of which Lincoln had one. In 1949, the National Trust for Historic Preservation was created. It was chartered by Congress, but it's not a governmental organization. It's a nonprofit advocacy organization really fighting at the national level for historic preservation and saving historic buildings. And then in 1966 is really the landmark case, or the landmark legislation for historic preservation, the National Historic Preservation Act. And that act in particular was important for creating the National Register of Historic Places and federal review and oversight of projects. And our first National Register listing in the city of Lincoln was 1969, the Kennard House. And then also that year was the listing of Old City Hall. And then in 1976, so we had established this program of preservation, but we really didn't have anything to support financially local preservation activities. So in 1976, the federal income tax incentive for certified historic rehabilitation was enacted. We just call it the historic tax credit. It's been amended a few times at the national level in 1981 and 1986. And then since then, there's been state level historic preservation tax credits all across the nation. Nebraska has had one for a number of years. We almost lost it a few years ago, but it's back, helping support rehab projects throughout the state. And then in 1978 was an important Supreme Court case in New York City that basically upheld this idea that historic preservation is a public purpose and you can limit property owners from demolishing historic structures. An example of a really great historic tax credit project is up in Havelock, the Lancaster block. It was constructed in 1890, before Havelock was actually an incorporated city. It was directly associated with the settlement of that town. And the building was also the venue of the strikers' meeting during the Burlington Shop strike of 1922. And the strike was a major precipitating event in Havelock's decline during the 20s, leading to its annexation in the city in the 1930s. So, historic photo of the building, kind of a shabbier version when they painted it white, messed with the storefront, and then post-rehab where they brought it back to its original glory. So looking specifically at Lincoln's history with a historic preservation program, we adopted our historic preservation ordinance into the city's zoning code in 1980. The following year, we adopted our first historic district at the local level. It was the Mount Emerald Historic District in 1981, followed by the Haymarket Historic District in 1982, and then our first individual home designation in 1983 was the Pauley House. So a couple interesting postcards from Mount Emerald. There's quite a few of these in our records at the city. It's a very fashionable district at the time. And then Haymarket, you can see all the changes that have taken place in the district over the years. The Granger building in the forefront, but unfortunately the building right behind it was not saved. That's just a parking lot today. And then the Pauley House. It's located just west of Sunken Gardens at 26th and C Street. It was built for Ray C. Pauley. He was a secretary at his father, Conrad Pauley's lumber company. And this is an example of a home where we didn't really have an early architect, but based on who they put on the building permit, we're assuming that it was a house plan out of the A.S. Barnes and Company, who back in the day produced all these little house plan books. You could pick out whatever house you want and take it to the lumber shop and get a home built. But it's also a really good example of a prairie school style building. We don't have a lot of these in the city of Lincoln, so it makes a good example for our local program. And then mentioned in the introduction, we are a certified local government, which is just jargon from the National Park Service that basically says we're a local preservation program. And it covers the city of Lincoln. We've talked about doing a county level certified local government, which would open us up to additional funding. But at the moment, it's just city level. It's housed in the planning department in our long range planning division. And there's one staff member with some administrative support for running the program. And we receive certified local government grants annually to help with different projects like funding the Brown Bag program here today, or doing local or national register nominations or education outreach, and just staff time to run the Historic Preservation Commission. Some of the activities. So answering daily inquiries, people wanting to know the history of their home or their building, or conducting surveys, managing the Historic Preservation Commission, public outreach and education, Section 106 reviews, and completing nominations. So examples of the daily inquiries, someone will write in or call and want to know, what's the history of their home, when it was built, who lived there, or they're purchasing a building and want to know the history of it. And I will say, in the 12 years since I was an intern until to now, it's gotten so much easier to do this research. You're not going to the library or the SHPO office to scroll through newspapers on the microfiche, just trying to catch some keywords, or flipping through actual 1926 city directories, hoping the pages don't fall apart. All of this stuff has been digitized, and it's so much easier to look up the history of a home or building. And so we have subscriptions to a couple different things to look through newspapers. You can keyword search and find early owners or images of homes after they were constructed. Some of the bigger homes were published in the newspapers. Or if we're looking for who lived in the home and why they're important, we'll find articles on them. City directories can be helpful if we don't have an original building permit. So if it was in Havelock, we might not have the original permit because it wasn't part of Lincoln. And so we kind of look through city directories to narrow down when it could have been built. Same with the deed records. You can search when it was transferred, how much it was transferred for. And then our Sanborn fire insurance maps. This was a program where they were mapping properties throughout the country. We have them for, I think, about 6 different years, starting in 1886, I believe, and ending in 1949, so you can see the progression of whether there was a home on that lot or not. We conduct surveys and a couple different types of surveys. So individual, we have over 13,000 individual surveys. I scanned every single file for these as an intern, and then when I came back, mapped them all and put them up on our website, so you can actually go, and I'll show that a little bit later, where you can go and look at the history of any property that we've researched. We have reconnaissance level surveys. Those are what we call windshield surveys. They're high level. They're based on a geographic area. The big orange boundary is our county survey that was done, I think, in 2009. So we pick an area or neighborhood. We go window or door by door, taking pictures of the homes, writing down information about what type of roof it has, what the material is, what the foundation is. So we have a good sense of what's in a district and can start to identify whether there might be a good district nomination. Then there's also thematic surveys. These are usually statewide surveys or larger areas based on a theme like aviation or railroads. So we have maybe a couple properties that are part of these larger surveys that are actually in the city of Lincoln. One example of a slightly older one, this was from 2007. It was a bridge inventory, so you can see the level of detail that goes into it. Photographs of the bridge, information on how big it is, what type of materials, when it was surveyed. And then we have our Historic Preservation Commission. It's a 7-member commission that's appointed by the mayor, and we have in our ordinance criteria for who needs to be on that commission to make sure we have a broad representation of people that are reviewing certificates and nominations and things coming through the commission. So it should be consisted of 2 architects, a historian qualified in the field of American history, a registered landscape architect if available, a licensed realtor, and 2 citizens at large. They serve for 3 years and meet the 3rd Thursday of every month. Part of our education program for years and years and years, it was tons of talks and lectures and tours, all wonderful offerings done by Ed. And since he retired, he's still doing all those wonderful, great things. And so at the city, we've tried to focus on educating homeowners, letting them know, hey, you're in a historic district and this is what it means. So we sent postcards to everyone in a local landmark district or that owns a local landmark property 2 years ago, I believe. As part of our design standards project, we sent letters to everyone saying, hey, you're in a historic district, this is what it means. We're also updating your guidelines, so here's your opportunity to participate. And then about 1.5 years ago, we developed a flyer for realtors and title agents, understanding, as we were trying to do this education outreach for the design standards project, so many people buy properties in a district and have no idea they're in a historic district. And it's something that we're trying to change to make it automatic that, you know, if you're buying a property, you go through the disclosure and you understand that this is a historic property, this is what it means for me. But we also did some presentations at Home and Woods Brothers, some of their meetings, to give them the resources on how to look it up, or just give contact information to call us. And following the design standards project, we want to be able to give tools to homeowners to be able to work with their historic buildings and to rehab them. And so we have a window restoration workshop that we're putting together August 31st. We'll have 3 different time slots for registrants to attend and learn all about restoring your historic wood window. So you might have a leaky wood window. It's not necessarily worth just throwing it out and getting a new one. You could possibly weather strip, do new glazing, upgrade the window, and put it back in place and preserve the historic material of your home. And so really excited to be able to offer this. And as part of that certified local government grant, we're looking at doing more of these types of trainings all throughout the next year. That grant cycle starts in October, so probably next spring we'll have some more of these available. I mentioned Section 106. So this is what came out of the 1966 Historic Preservation Act. It requires any federal agency to consider the impact to historic properties and abate any negative impacts. It also applies to any federal funding that flows into cities. And so a lot of what we do is basic staff level reviews, and a lot of it comes from our urban development department. They operate 2 really great, or a couple different great housing rehab programs for low-income property owners, and one of them being lead abatement, which is a huge issue in historic buildings. And so a lot of elevated lead levels contribute to negative youth cognition. And so a really great grant that came out of HUD helps abate that. And so we see a lot of requests from that program to remove wood windows that have lead paint all over them, or work with siding that has lead paint. 2 others are cell towers. So as part of the FCC, they have to notify us if there's a new tower or if they're co-locating equipment on towers, and request whether it's going to have an impact on historic structures in Lincoln. And then the Nebraska Department of Transportation, any roadway projects that are going through historic districts or around historic neighborhoods, has a big review. And they can be something basic at staff level, or like the South Beltway had a very large environmental review process, looking at how that project could impact historic structures. And then nominations, we have 2 basic types of historic nominations. There's the local landmarks, which I had alluded to earlier as part of the zoning ordinance. It's considered a zoning overlay. So we have our basic zoning that says this is residential, this is industrial, this is commercial. And then the overlays are kind of an extra layer on top of those base zoning layers. And so the historic district is a zoning overlay that preserves the base zoning. It's approved with a set of design guidelines at the moment. I'll talk about the design standards project, which is going to go away from individual sets of design guidelines for every single property and district, which we have 116 at the moment, which is a lot to manage. And then it's only at the city level. And then we've done a few county designations, but they're not quite the same as our local landmarks. And then National Register, we call that the honor roll of historic preservation. It takes a lot more research and time and energy to get something on the National Register, because it's rising to that level of beyond just city significance. But there's no design guidelines, review requirements, or anything that goes along with a National Register nomination, unless federal funding is involved. And we have nominations in both the city and the county. And they can both be individual buildings or historic districts. And our comprehensive plan, the long-range vision for the city of Lincoln, we do a full update every 10 years. Every 5 years, we do a smaller update. We're actually starting it next year. As part of that, there's an element in there for historic preservation. as an important goal for the city of Lincoln. And we track metrics for our comprehensive plan and update those every year. And so we've been, as part of that, we call it the community indicators, tracking how our district designations have been going. And in 1980, when we first started our program, you can see there was a lot more local and this is just districts on this chart, a lot more local districts that were completed as compared to National Register. And then in about 2000, that completely flipped, and we haven't done a local landmark designation since Havelock in, I think, 2007. And I think a lot of that has to do with there was a lot of momentum once the Historic Preservation Ordinance was first passed, a lot of neighborhoods that wanted to preserve the history. Local landmarks are a good way to do that because it has the protections that go along with it. And that sentiment has kind of shifted where it's hard to get all the property owners in a neighborhood on board with the design guidelines that go along with it and review processes. For individual district designations, it's kind of been the opposite, and I'll talk about that why in a little bit, but before the designation, or before the ordinance in 1980, there was a few National Register nominations, and then after 1980 is when you start to see the local landmarks, the purple color, come in there. Had about equal amounts of National Register and local landmarks, one county board designation in that decade, and then it started to shift to be a lot more local landmark designations and fewer National Register designations. And then design reviews. So any property that's in a local landmark district or is locally landmarked as an individual property has to get a certificate of appropriateness for changes to the exterior of the structure if it's beyond just routine maintenance. And so we track also how many reviews we're doing every year. And it's just kind of interesting to see in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot more reviews coming before the department and going to Historic Preservation Commission. And I think the uptick in the last couple of years has been attributed to a lot more of that owner education and sending out the postcards and talking with neighborhood organizations about the program. So the historic district designation or the zoning overlay, you can adopt it under 3 different criteria, A, B, and C. A is associated with events, people, or persons who've made a significant contribution to the history, heritage, and culture of the city of Lincoln, Lancaster County, Nebraska, or the United States. Or represents architectural style and innovation, work of a craftsman whose work is significant in developing the city of Lincoln. And then the last one represents archaeological value that it yields or may be likely to yield information. I was curious what kind of designations we had. Almost all of our designations are in those first 2 categories. A lot of them, 61%, are both A and B designated with events and people and the architectural style or craftsman, or they're one or the other, A or B, events and people or style. There's 2 homes that appear with criterion C, and I'm not entirely certain why. The designation doesn't really go into why we classified C or checked that, but one is the Wheelhouse and one is the Ricketts House. And then also curious what kind of architectural styles, since we have so many homes and buildings nominated under that criterion B, what kinds of buildings were we designating? And this is only the individual designations. I'm sure if someone had a ton of time and energy, they could go in and try and classify all of the building architectural styles in our districts. But individually, we see a lot of the higher style. There's a lot of Foursquare, Neoclassical Revival, Queen Anne's, and Tudor Revivals for individual designations. Art Deco is probably in that category, but you really don't see a lot of the really basic style of homes like a bungalow or a cottage style home as an individual designation. And I think that's because we've been relying a lot on architectural style and less on individuals and social history for our designations. And there's kind of a third category of designations. It's called the Multiple Property Documentation Form. It's a National Park Service, a national level document. It basically goes thoroughly into the history of a topic, identifies why it's significant, what the trends were, and then lists out a whole bunch of buildings that on their own probably wouldn't be eligible for the National Register, but as part of this theme or this district has some significance. And so I think I'm pretty sure this is the most recent multiple property documentation form that was done for Lincoln. And it's the African American Historic and Architectural Resources in Lincoln. And the building that was designated along with this at the same time is the Quinn AME Chapel. I've referenced the design standards a few times. This has been a year-long project to consolidate 116 individual sets of design guidelines into one document. As I mentioned, every single property or district has its own set. The design guidelines, now we're calling them standards because of where we're putting them in our city ordinance. It has information on how to maintain and preserve and rehab historic homes in our local landmark districts. And they're intended to be a tool both for homeowners when they're starting projects to understand this is what I need to do to preserve the historic integrity, but also for the historic preservation to review when certificate requests come before them. There's obviously documents that are over 40 years old, and the original intent was to look at these every 5 years and update them. It was spelled out in Mount Emerald that we would have these periodic reviews, but never got around to it. So a lot of the language is very old, doesn't address modern technology. There's many districts that don't reference solar power at all, or it's half of a sentence that might say something about solar, and we're seeing a lot more of that, especially with Lincoln's Climate Action Plan and trying to support renewable energy. And every single document is text only. There's no images to help an owner understand what we mean when we say a baluster needs to be preserved. So the goal was to make it clear, easy to understand, make it less onerous, save time, and provide a ton more resources for homeowners. So on our website is this image, and it's clickable. I worked with one of our tech people, did an amazing job. So you can either click the list below it that says landscape, or you can hover across the little landscape and it'll pop up that and take you right to the page that has the guidance for it. So the project started back in 2023 in June, kind of kicked off, started organizing how we wanted to approach it. We did an event at Streets Alive. We had a booth. We went to a number of different neighborhood association meetings. I think it's like 6 or 7 of our neighborhoods have historic districts in them. And so we made sure to reach out to all of them. I think some of them put information in their newsletters trying to promote the project, and attended meetings to discuss it and get feedback. Then in May of this year, we had our first open house. I was widely surprised that over 40 people showed up to a preservation open house to talk about the guidelines and learn more. Historic Preservation Commission had their public hearing on the full final document. So over the last year, every single month, they've been reviewing a different section of the guidelines, biting off in little chunks, and then the entire full document came before them for their public hearing in May, went to Planning Commission on June 26th. It is now going to City Council for public hearing on next Monday, and then vote the following week. And so I think it's almost a month from now, they'll be fully in effect, assuming that everything goes to plan at City Council and it gets approved. And so the one set of design standards will be in effect for all historic properties locally designated. And the goal with this was to make it a lot easier for homeowners, because Historic Preservation Commission only meets once a month. So if your project comes in a week before that meeting, you're waiting an entire month and a week before you can go back before the Historic Preservation Commission. And the intent is we were pretty specific about what the standards are, lots of resources, images, here's what we really intend. So if you meet the standards, pretty much everything is an administrative review. So you can have your certificate, get your project going within a day or two. If it does not meet the standards, you're basically asking for a waiver. There's some unforeseen circumstance or a material we didn't know about when we adopted these that could be an okay method for preserving a historic building, or you're doing something major like a large addition or new construction in a historic district. That's when you have to go to Historic Preservation Commission. But really trying to streamline the reviews and send less things to Historic Preservation Commission, because there's plenty, signs especially, they're pretty basic projects, and we would delay a sign install for about a month just for HPC to approve it within 5 minutes. So there's being 116 sets of standards. They're all a little bit different in how they're formatted or what was in them, but generally, this is what's in our standards. We talk about the environment of the district, what type of exterior materials go on a building, the roofing, windows and doors, your entrances, porches, mechanical services, how to treat new construction in a district, and then safety and building code. We altered some of those sections, so environment got wrapped into our new site and landscaping section. Windows and doors we broke into 2 separate sections. We added balconies, patios, and docks to our porches and entrances. And then missing technology on the mechanical services like solar and renewable energy. And then new construction, we added guidance for if it's a non-contributing building in a historic district. And then new topics, a bunch of new topics. And the way we based the guidelines was looking at the National Park Service, the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation is kind of the basis, and how a lot of our existing guidelines were adopted was based on their guidance. And so we looked at their latest edition, and then also some peer communities. Denver has some really great historic preservation standards. And then I think Omaha, we looked at what they have in theirs because they recently updated their design guidelines as well. And then came up with a few new sections, specifically talking about additions, architectural details, accessory buildings and garages. A lot of them, it was like 2 sentences on how to treat a garage, foundation, signs, the landscaping section, storefronts. We have our 2 kind of big historic districts, Haymarket and Havelock, and they didn't really address how we treat storefronts. And then weatherization and insulation is more of like guidance. And then specifically the landscape section became quite large. These are all the different subheadings within that landscape section. So beyond just landscaping, we talk about commercial streetscapes, alleys and service areas. We include the parking and the landscaping that we've always had, and then we talk about grading and site work, which can have a big impact on a historic property if you're starting to tear up the front yard or regrade things. Fences and walls, lighting, and then artwork is becoming more and more prevalent. We're seeing lots of murals and sculptures, and we didn't really have a way for HPC to review these kind of projects, and so we have a section on how to treat artwork in our historic districts. So an example of what our existing guidelines, most of them have this kind of recommended, not recommended format. It's what was in the Secretary of the Interior standards many years ago. The new section has kind of an introductory paragraph, bullet list of things you should and shouldn't do, and then a ton of pictures that show, here's good examples. You can't really see it. When you look online, there's red boundaries and then green boundaries. So the green highlighted pictures are good examples, red are the don't do this. And then added a lot of diagrams, like the one in the bottom right that's here's a porch, here's what we mean by baluster and column and rails, so that way when we're talking with homeowners, they understand it. And then added a lot of new resources. There's 2 kind of sets of guides that the National Park Service puts out. The ITS, which is just interpreting the standards, bulletins, and then the NPS bulletins. And so in any section that had relevant bulletins, we link them as helpful links at the end of the document, so you can go reference that if you want more information. And then we have call-out boxes like lead-based paint and historic preservation. How do you approach that? Guidance from HUD, since a lot of our projects are HUD funded. And we couldn't do this project without updating the historic preservation ordinance, because today it says every individual property or district gets its own set of standards. So we had to go in and update that language to say it's one set of standards for all historic properties moving forward. And so while we were in there, we thought we'd do some fun little projects, which include creating the thematic district. And this is very similar and based off that multiple property documentation form I was referencing earlier, where these buildings are scattered all throughout Lincoln. They're collectively a theme, like corner stores, but you can't create a district today because they're not all next to each other in one boundary. And so we've defined a new thematic district that lets us do a designation based on this theme. The first one that's almost ready to go actually is corner stores. We've identified 23 that are still standing of the, I think it's 150 or so that used to be in Lincoln. But they represent a really important method of development or land use pattern that Lincoln used to have, where you had these little corner groceries in the neighborhoods, you walked or took the trolley, and how that evolved and changed into this regional system of grocery stores, and how that's impacted how our communities have developed. We also looked at demolition. So we've had a few recent requests to demolish historic buildings come through. The Women's Club is one that kind of outlined how our demolition ordinance looks now, because Historic Preservation Commission they had nothing to review it against. We didn't have clear criteria. It was questionable what you submit to be able to review whether a building is beyond repair or not. So we've outlined, it's always been a last resort, extreme situations is what we prefer. Demolition by neglect is prohibited now, so you can't just let your building sit and wait for it to be so bad that you have to tear it down. Properties, and we have in there today that you can come in, request to demolish a building, HPC says no, denies it. You're supposed to work with the property owners to come up with an alternate solution. If none's reached, after 90 days, you can go demolish your building. So it didn't have a lot of teeth, and so we've amended it to have kind of two pieces. If your building is existing today, you have now a 1-year wait period. We couldn't take away the right to demolish because that's what you had when you purchased the building, when it was designated. So we've just extended that time period, hoping that people will, instead of waiting an entire year, will just try and rehab their historic buildings. Or under new designation, so if you come in after this ordinance gets updated, Historic Preservation Commission can say, no, you haven't given us a good enough reason and provided the material to support demolition, you're denied. They can appeal it to the city council, and city council can say, HPC had it right, you cannot demolish. So new buildings going forward, I think, have a much better chance at rehab on some of these that we've lost in recent years. And then this is, I was mentioning with the Women's Club, these are the things that we now require you to submit for HPC to be able to review in detail whether or not it's valid. So an analysis by an engineer of its structural condition, alternatives analysis. So if I demolish it, this is what would happen. If I rehab it, this is what would happen. If I do nothing, this is what would happen. And then we added some text prohibiting new construction for an entire year if you demolish a building without an approval. So a penalty for doing anything with the site if you didn't ask permission. And then violations, this has always been, it's been in every single set of our design guidelines, but it never made it into the ordinance where it actually has teeth. And so we're just pulling this language into our ordinance. So if you do work without prior approval, you can get a fine of $100 a day. As the violation continues, each day is a different violation. And it's not intended to be this like big, that we're going out and finding people all over. I mean, we would obviously send letters and say, hey, did you know you're in a historic district? You need this review, come to the Historic Preservation Commission. If it's something where they're just blatantly ignoring the ordinance and doing work, that's where this can give us some teeth. And I mentioned before about how we've kind of switched and had a lot more local individual designations than we've had National Register nominations in recent years, and I'm pretty sure the special permit for historic preservation is why. This is a really unique tool to the city of Lincoln. I haven't seen this in many other communities, and it was adopted with the original, it was adopted technically before the original designation or the historic ordinance in 1979, but it's in our zoning code. It's in any district. It allows you to waive any zoning requirements that make it hard to preserve a historic building. For example, Yeagle Grocery Store, it's at 11th and Peach, I think. Former grocery store, corner store, 2-story building. It's in a zoning district that is, I think, allows duplexes is it. But it's a very large building, and the people that bought it wanted to do multifamily, I think 5 or 6 units. So the historic preservation special permit was applied for to allow the rehab and reuse of this building that was just sitting vacant for many, many years as multifamily, and it's been very successful. I bike past it every day, and it's a great use in the neighborhood. And then you can also waive things like parking or sign regulations, or height or area, because a lot of times buildings were built to their property lines and there's nowhere to put parking, and so they either sit vacant and they don't get used, or we use a tool like the special permit for historic preservation to allow them to occupy the building with the new use without having to add parking. Review process, I kind of talked about this a little bit, but we have 2 reviews. Administrative, we call it a certificate of no material effect. It's done at staff level, approved by the planning director. This is what we think we'll do a lot more of moving forward after the design standards, because if you meet the standards, you get administrative review. Today, it's very limited situations where we do the certificate of no material effect, and a lot of stuff goes to Historic Preservation Commission for the certificate of appropriateness. There's also a certificate of exception and allowance, which comes into play with demolitions, but we don't do a whole lot of those. Today, the review process can take as little as a month or several months, depending on the project scope or what, where you land on deadlines, and triggered for major alterations. And wrap up with our online resources. So I've spent the last couple years adding a ton of resources and information to our website to make it easier for maintaining your historic home. So this came even before the design guidelines started putting information on how to rehab, how to deal with lead paint, window rehab, energy efficiency. And then we put together, a few staff from other departments and SHPO put together this document on financing rehabilitation, because there's the historic tax credits, the valuation incentive program that you could take advantage of, but some other unique ones like tax increment financing or our PACE program, which is an energy efficiency program. So there's other ways that you could maybe do a historic rehab. The reconnaissance surveys that I mentioned earlier, they're all mapped online, so you can go and click on one of these little boundaries and it'll pop up a link to the document. You can flip through it. Individual surveys, this is what I was talking about earlier, where we have over 13,000 of these. So it used to be a system, each one of these blue boxes was a boundary on a physical map that was all rolled up and was deteriorating, and you'd handwrite in the survey number for each one. So all of that became digital, so you can click on a little box and it'll pop up all the information that we have to date. So when it was built, if it's part of a district, when that district was designated, house history, and then that survey information I talked about when we were doing those kind of windshield surveys of what's the architectural style, what's the roof, is there accessory buildings, all that. If you keep scrolling down there, that's all there. And then our individual and our districts nominations, it's all on an interactive site, color coded based on whether it's National Register, local, or has both designations. You can search by the designation name, or you can search in the address bar and try and find if you're in a historic district or not. And then when you click learn more on whichever district or property, it'll give you the nomination form and the history, and today the design guidelines that are associated with it. So here's an example. If you click on an individual property, it gives you a couple pictures, usually a historic and a current, some basic information on designation type, when it was built, architect, builder, and a summary, and then the link to the documents. And then a COVID project for me was mapping all of our sandboard maps and this 1912 atlas. So we took all the individual documents. This one in particular, I think, is like 12 documents. When you zoom in, it pops up the more detailed version of the document underneath it, but it has little boundaries or little drawings of what buildings were where. So it's kind of helpful in historic research. The sandboard maps, so today it's like 2 or 3 blocks, ends up on a page. You have to go to the main key, figure out where you are, and then figure out what map number that is, and then go to it. So I stitched them all together, and we overlaid them on our GIS map, so you can play with the transparency and see what's underneath it there today and what was there in 1886, for example. So this is 9th and N Street on the left side, and 11th and on the east side. So big apartment complex, used to have a couple little buildings on it. A few more of established, and then the color codes are brick for pink and frame construction for yellow, and then how it's changing over time. Fortunately, the 1928s just didn't work very well. You can kind of get the gist of what was there, but you can't really read the description of dwelling, commercial, or whatever it says. And then 1949. So we have about 10 more minutes if there's any questions about the preservation program and the offerings or anything. Yeah.
So Stephanie, you mentioned, and it was really helpful to see how you enforce that there's a penalty that's associated with it if you don't comply.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's good that you work with homeowners to encourage them for compliance. But when you have that property owner that just isn't interested in compliance, who makes that decision on enforcement? Is that the city attorney's office that eventually decides whether to go ahead and do something about that property owner?
It would start with the planning department and probably management level staff of, where are we at? How long has this violation been going on? And are we, how much in fines have we had it to this point? And then it would go up to our law department to start prosecuting on something like that. Since it's only been in our guidelines today, we haven't done that, to my knowledge. I don't know, in Ed's time, if he ever had to enforce anything like that.
I think there's a role that the building safety, as the building officials enforcing the zoning code, come between planning and law department.
Mm-hmm.
Often, building officials would want to have the planner act as the enforcer, even when they're building from a violation. I think it's complicated between the two departments. I think the hammer is more in the hands of the building and safety department. So planning would be informing building and safety, and they would then be working with planning and law on it, because it's a violation of the zoning code. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, and there's different situations. So if it's not something that needs a building permit, say if you're just doing siding and you get siding without permission, it would never need a building permit to put vinyl siding on your house, but it violates our code. And so technically...
But they still enforce the zoning code.
Okay.
Planners don't enforce the zoning code.
Mm-hmm.
They interpret it, they know it, they're involved in discussion.
Yeah.
But the siding would be a zoning code violation potentially
Mm-hmm.
of 2757.
Mm-hmm. And depending on the level too, there's the vacant and neglected building registry for residential property. So if it's something that's sitting there and creating public hazard and is blighted, that's something that can end up on the registry, and there's penalties, or there's a registration fee that you have to pay to be on that. And so it encourages people to rehab their properties or get rid of them.
Stephanie, I have a question about historic district designations for neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the criteria that a neighborhood would need to meet that designation? And do you have to get permissions from lots of neighbors, or how does that work?
So as far as district designations, you don't technically need everyone in the district to agree to want to be in the district, but because it is something, since it is a zoning overlay, it is a council approved. It goes Preservation Commission, Planning Commission, City Council. So for City Council to want to approve a district designation, if there's significant opposition by homeowners, I don't think that it would probably get approved. The criteria for designating are these three here. So you just have to make a good enough case that it meets one of these three criteria, have a pretty thorough nomination for why it's significant under that criteria, and then list out all the buildings that would be part of it. So with the district, it gets a little more intense because you need to know what buildings are contributing or not contributing, when they were built, basic information about each one of them, and then collectively as a district, why they're important under one of these categories.
The age of the building obviously matters, right? Is it more than 50 years old?
Technically.
Yeah.
50 years is the general rule. There have been a few National Register nominations that have not locally here, I don't think, but nationally that have gone away from that, and we're like 47 years old for a really significant modern style building, but 50 years is generally what we say.
I think the Lincoln Code hadn't mentioned a year requirement where the National Register did. The Lincoln Code has traditionally followed closely on the concepts of National Register.
Mm-hmm.
50's gotten to be a lot fewer years.
Right.
So you mentioned you don't have to have every property owners to be in a district?
No, the code doesn't actually say you need some codes say you need at least 60% of property owners to sign on or something like that. Our code doesn't actually say a specific number.
Is there still language about a certain number of registered opponents could block a designation? I think there was, but we never, it never was prudent to designate a district. We also didn't want to set neighbors against neighbors.
Yeah.
And we did some boundary work, East Campus particularly, where there was a real strong core who very much wanted designation, and some edges that didn't. And we did survey of who was where and adjusted some boundaries to help preserve peace, and it really advanced the whole project.
So what kind of limitations are created with that designation? I mean, why were the neighbors over there opposed to it?
But if it's the local, then it puts in place these design standards on
Mhm.
individual work. If it's
Yeah.
national, one reason that more national was being done was with these large districts to be able to say honestly, this does not say what you can do with your property. It says it's important, it helps the realtors know there's something real special here, it gives you information about your property, if it doesn't say what you can do with it. Local was more favored when people were worried about what their neighbor would do, or the areas that were under zoning threat, kind of the inconsistency between how they were built and how they were zoned today, much of which was changed by some of the down zones. Also lowered the temperature on fear of, is the first thing I hear about it when the orange fence goes up around the house beside me. If you were under that threat, you might want historic designation, so you have more reading.
Is there a way to protect a component of your property? We have a 1939 home in Indian Village. We have a very old wrought iron fence. I mean, it is sturdy, it's braced in concrete on the ends and the middle. But we didn't know if there's a way to preserve destruction of that by LTU.
That's a good question. I mean, you can do a National Register nomination for an object. Most recent example is the War and Victory Memorial in Antelope Park. That one is an object being nominated to the National Register. I don't know that we have any local that are object-based. Typically, it's part of the full property, and it would need to have some significance on its own versus just a really nice old fence. But Indian Village, we're actually trying to get a National Register nomination through. It made its way all the way to the National Park Service, and it was based on Laura B. Wood and her significance as she claimed, Nebraska's first and only woman builder of the time. And we thought we had a good argument for it, and then the National Park Service sent it back and said, prove it by researching everyone across Nebraska and also do the Midwest while you're at it and really prove that she is, in fact, this significant, even though we were just doing it at the local level. For the nomination. So we actually got a underrepresented communities grant from the National Park Service, and the project is kicking off tomorrow with our consultant to hire them to do that intensive level of research for us to prove, hopefully, that we're right, that she is the first woman builder of her time for the city of Lincoln and significant across the state of Nebraska, and hoping to pick up several other significant women in the trades industry to be able to do nominations in other parts of the state and provide that information to other CLGs.
Yeah, it's wonderful, and we appreciate that in our neighborhood. Unfortunately, I don't have a Laura Wood house.
Ah.
But it's just, there seem to be so few examples, and I don't know, maybe Ed, you know better than I, but so few examples of old wrought iron fences, not these cheap crappy things people put up now.
There are a few. I think you'd really be doing a house and site and saying this is a key element of the site.
Yeah,
But to say the fence without the house,
so it'd have to be a package thing.
I think you'd have to make an environmental argument about a designed landscape, in effect, with some hardscape features as part of it.
See, I think that comes up with hitching posts in front of houses where they may not have as much of a significance to the house itself as a fence. But, you know, we've seen, you know, some of those disappear.
Well, we're basically at time, so I appreciate you all for staying for the talk.